On June 12, 2017, 24-year-old Zoe Morris went hiking in Great Smoky Mountains National Park with an experienced 30-year-old guide, James Nelson. At 9 o'clock in the morning, she sent a last message to her friend, after which she lost contact with the group forever. When the hikers did not show up at the gathering point, the park became the site of a large-scale search operation. Only 3 weeks later, 8 miles from the planned route, the girls' torn clothes were found, which only deepened the mystery of the disappearance. You will find out where Zoe really went and what happened to her guide in the wilds of Appalachia in this video. The events in this story are presented as a narrative interpretation. Some elements have been altered or recreated for storytelling purposes. 24-year-old Zoe Morris was what her friends called the sunshine of any group. She had just completed her master's degree in biology at the University of North Carolina, and this trip was to be a symbolic end to her academic journey and the beginning of a new life. Zoe was an extremely responsible and prepared girl. She never took unnecessary risks and paid great attention to safety. So she hired an experienced 30-year-old guide, James Nelson, to travel the difficult and sometimes wild route in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. James was considered one of the best specialists in Tennessee, with an impeccable reputation and more than a decade of experience on the most difficult sections of the Appalachian Trail. Her parents, Patricia and Robert, later recalled in an interview with a local television station that they had a strange sense of anxiety on the day of her departure, although there was no objective reason to worry at the time. The morning of June 12, 2017, in the Newfound Gap area, was foggy, but forecasters predicted sunny weather with a temperature of about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. The last contact with the girl took place at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, when she sent a short message to her best friend Sarah. According to the investigation materials and her friend's testimony, the text read as follows: "We're starting the climb from Newfound Gap. The views are incredible. James is a great guide. I'll be in touch in 3 days." After that, Zoe's cell phone went offline forever, and the signal from the last cell tower was detected at an altitude of more than 5,000 feet above sea level in a densely forested area where coverage becomes unstable. When the group did not return to the meeting point near the Silver Spruce private estate at 18 o'clock on June 15th, the family immediately raised the alarm. The Tennessee State Police, along with National Park Rangers, launched a large-scale search operation, but the situation was getting stranger by the hour. Not only was an inexperienced tourist missing, but also a high-level professional who knew these forests like the back of his hand and had all the necessary equipment to survive in extreme conditions. Officers combed through miles of dense rhododendron bushes and rocky slopes, using helicopters with thermal imagers and specially trained service dogs. The Sevier County Sheriff later noted in a report that search conditions were made much more difficult by the sudden decrease in visibility and the dense cloud cover that descended on the mountains the night after the disappearance. The first 3 days of the active phase did not bring any clues. Rescuers found no traces of a fire, no food remains, and no characteristic shoe prints on the wet mountain soil. The Morris family was in a state of unbearable anticipation, constantly staying at the rescue headquarters in the hope of hearing at least some news about their daughter. The private estate, Silver Spruce, which was supposed to be the place of the joyful finish of the journey, has now turned into a symbol of uncertainty and horror. Zoya's friends, who helped the volunteers, described the atmosphere of those days as an oppressive silence that seemed to absorb any sounds of search whistles and shouts. Investigators began to examine the billing of the phones of both missing persons in detail, but the result was disappointing. Both devices were turned off almost simultaneously, shortly after the last message was sent. This suggested some kind of sudden and unpredictable event that left no time for even a short emergency call to the 911 service. The search area was expanding with each passing hour, covering more and more remote and inaccessible areas off the official tourist routes. But the mountains continued to be silent. The police analyzed the surveillance footage at the entrance to the park, which clearly showed James Nelson's car pulling into the parking lot at 7 o'clock 45 minutes in the morning on June 12th. Everything pointed to the usual beginning of a professional tour, but the chain of events was cut short at the point where Appalachian nature becomes most severe. Missing persons specialists noted that such a traceless disappearance of two adults, one of whom has professional survival skills, is extremely atypical for this region. However, there were no signs of a struggle or any other presence on the initial part of the path. As volunteers and rangers battled the weather and rough terrain, the sheriff's office began to formulate the first working theories, none of which provided a logical explanation for how two people could simply vanish into thin air in broad daylight. The darkness of the Great Smoky Mountains forests guarded its secrets, leaving family and friends in thrall to endless unanswered questions. The maps spread out on the forensic scientists' desks were covered with mile markers, but none of them led to any real clues. Time was working against the missing, and with every sunset, the chances of finding them alive were rapidly decreasing, turning the search operation into a real challenge for all the services involved. Every stone and every tree on the route from Newfound Gap was examined dozens of times, but the forest gave no clues about the fate of Zoe and James, forcing the investigation to look for answers where no one expected to find them. The active phase of the large-scale search officially ended 14 days after the disappearance, when the National Park authorities and Tennessee State Police concluded that further involvement of hundreds of people and expensive equipment was not yielding any results. However, hope still glowed in the hearts of the volunteers and next of kin, who categorically refused to believe the worst and continued to take to the trails in small groups. On July 3, 2017, exactly 21 days after the last message from Zoe Morris, one of these groups of 4 experienced hikers was passing a difficult area near the cliff of Charles Banyan. This area is famous for its sheer cliffs and elevation of over 5,500 feet above sea level, where wind gusts are commonly disorienting and visibility can change in a matter of minutes. One of the volunteers, Mark Jenkins, later described in a report to the Ranger Service that his attention was drawn to an atypical color in the dense undergrowth of mountain laurel. Bending down under the twisted branches, he found a strange bundle of cloth, half-pressed into the damp soil and sprinkled with dry pine needles. It turned out to be Zoe Morris's personal clothes, her favorite turquoise sports top of a well-known brand, and dark gray bicycles. The state of affairs, according to eyewitnesses, caused an instant feeling of horror in everyone present, as the fabric was grossly torn in several places, especially in the shoulder seams and waistband, and was completely covered with a layer of dried mud mixed with small stones and pine needles. Forensic experts who quickly arrived at the scene by helicopter noted in the initial report that the nature of the injuries could indicate both a fierce struggle with the attacker and a sharp fall from a great height through sharp tree branches. When Patricia Morris was summoned to the sheriff's office to identify the items found, the atmosphere was tense to the point of overwhelm. As soon as the woman saw the familiar bright color on the metal evidence table, she instantly fainted, unable to bear the realization that this was the first real confirmation of the horrific event that had happened to her daughter. The girl's father, Robert, held on by sheer force of will, refusing water and demanding immediate answers from the detectives, which the police simply did not have at the time. Further examination at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation laboratory confirmed the presence of epithelium and microscopic particles of Zoe's skin on the inner surface of the fabric, but it was the location of the discovery that raised the most questions and outright confusion among experienced detectives. The clothes were found 8 miles from the planned route, which had been previously officially approved by 30-year-old guide James Nelson, and there was no logical explanation for how the girl could have ended up in this wilderness area without basic equipment and shoes. This distance in harsh mountain conditions, where each climb requires incredible physical effort, seemed absolutely insurmountable for a person without special training in such a short period of time. Investigators carefully measured every foot of the area around the discovery using metal detectors and sniffer dogs, but no other traces, no backpack, no sleeping bag, no sneakers, were found. The family continued to desperately believe that Zoe might still be alive. Perhaps she had suffered a head injury and was trapped in one of the many natural grottos or rocky crevices from which she could not escape on her own. However, the question of the fate of the 30-year-old guide James Nelson was becoming more and more acute and gloomy because no clues were found around the found clothes that would directly or indirectly indicate his presence nearby or his possible location. Whether he was there at that fateful moment, whether he was trying to save the girl from an unknown threat, or perhaps his own fate was even more tragic. The answers to these questions were safely hidden somewhere in the vast and silent Appalachian forests. The police began to seriously consider the possibility that the items could have been moved so far on purpose to lead the investigation astray, as a professional guide with such a reputation would never have allowed such a deviation from the route in unpredictable weather. Every report, every detailed photo from the place of discovery was carefully analyzed by the best profiler psychologists who tried to understand the logic of who left this bundle in the dense undergrowth of laurel. 3 weeks of uncertainty completely changed the life of the entire surrounding town, where every second resident participated in the search operations, and now the news of the found clothes spread like wildfire, generating many horrific rumors and incredible theories. The sheriff's office was working around the clock, processing hundreds of calls from people who had allegedly seen strange flashes of light or heard screams in the Charlie Banyan Cliff area, but none of these accounts gave a complete picture of what was happening. The main question that tormented everyone was where exactly was the person who bore full legal and moral responsibility for Zoe Morris's safety, and whether he himself had become part of that mysterious and cruel force that forced the girl to leave her torn clothes 8 miles from the original goal of the trip. The maps at the search headquarters were covered with new markings indicating each mile traveled, but the forest continued to maintain its icy silence, giving no hope of a quick resolution to this drama. Specialists in the search for missing persons noted that the condition of the found items indicated a rapid development of events, where the victim had no chance of rescue or prolonged resistance. In his address to the press that evening, the sheriff only briefly noted that the discovery near Charlie Banyan moved the case from the category of missing persons to the category of aggravated criminal investigation. Every detail, from the microscopic fibers on the fabric to the position of the branches above the bundle, was now being examined under powerful microscopes in the hope of finding at least a hint of what really happened on that foggy day of June 12th. But so far, the only real result of the 3-week effort was a piece of turquoise cloth that smelled of damp earth and fear. Despite the grim discovery near Charlie's Banyan Rock, the sheriff's office did not officially call off the search for a living person, as no body was ever found, and the hope of finding the girl in one of the many Appalachian caves was still the main driving force for volunteers. Zoe Morris's clothing was immediately sent for in-depth examination to a crime lab in Nashville to identify microscopic traces, fibers, or foreign biological materials that could shed light on the events of that fateful day. At the same time, the focus of the investigation shifted dramatically, and 30-year-old James Nelson became the main suspect in the case. The reason for this was the fact that he was the last person to contact the girl, and it was he who was fully responsible for her safety on the route. The investigation began to seriously consider the possibility that the experienced guide could have deliberately planted things 8 miles from the planned trail to lead detectives astray and buy precious time for his own hiding, or to destroy other evidence. His intimate knowledge of mountain trails and paths hidden from the eyes of ordinary tourists, gave him a huge advantage, allowing him to use the difficult landscape to his advantage and remain completely undetected even by official search teams using helicopters. The police were trying to find out at least some of the man's motives, since at first glance he had an impeccable professional reputation, no criminal record, and had never shown aggression or inappropriate behavior toward his clients in the 10 years he had been working. However, what the detectives saw at the scene of the clothing discovery looked more and more like a staged event, actions that had been carefully planned by a professional to direct the investigation's attention in the wrong direction from the real scene of the tragedy. In a private comment to the investigation, one of the park's experienced rangers noted that finding such a bundle of fabric in such a place without other items, such as heavy hiking boots or a 30-liter backpack, looks mathematically unlikely to be an accidental disappearance. Therefore, the police began a total investigation of the 30-year-old man's life, starting with his financial situation and ending with the circle of his closest acquaintances in the town of Gatlinburg. The detectives obtained search warrants for his home and his car, which was still parked in a parking lot at the foot of the mountains, covered with a layer of dust from the past 21 days. Inside Nelson's house, there was a perfect order, typical of a man with a military background or years of experience in surviving in the wild, where everything has its clearly defined place. Neighbors described James as a reserved but polite man who spent almost all his time in the mountains and rarely made lasting social contacts. Investigators seized his personal computer and work diaries, hoping to find at least some clue that he might have planned the crime in advance. Particular attention was paid to his route maps, which showed hundreds of miles of trails traveled, but none of the notes referred to the Charlie Banyan Cliff area in the context of his last tour with Zoe Morris. This only reinforced the suspicion that the guide was acting outside of his usual protocol. Profiling psychologists, analyzing the information gathered, hypothesized that behind the facade of a successful guide could be a person who felt completely in control of another person's life in isolation from civilization. The Tennessee State Police put James Nelson on an official wanted list as a person who might be involved in the girl's disappearance and sent his photographs to all nearby communities and tourist shelters along the Appalachian Trail. However, the more the detectives delved into his past, the more questions they had, because none of his previous clients could say a bad word about him. This created a strange dissonance between the image of the perfect guide and the gruesome evidence that was found in the jungle at an altitude of several thousand feet. While one group worked with the paper archives, the other continued to interview local residents who might have seen James in the days after June 12, 2017. Any detail, refueling a car, buying groceries, or a chance encounter on the road, could be decisive. Zoya's parents were completely desperate when they learned of the suspicions about the guide, as they had insisted on hiring a professional to keep their daughter safe. Their trust in the park's security system had been shattered, and the fear that their child was in the hands of a man who knew the forest better than anyone was becoming unbearable. Case number 7283 was becoming increasingly complicated, and each new day without news from James only reinforced the theory of his guilt. Investigators realized that if he was still in the forest, it would be almost impossible to find him against his will, as he had the camouflage and survival skills to go for months without outside help. Nevertheless, they kept up the pressure, hoping that somewhere in his carefully constructed plan there would be at least one crack that would lead them to the truth about the 24-year-old girl's fate. Every mile around Newfound Gap was now seen not as a picturesque landscape, but as a potential crime scene where every broken limb could indicate the presence of a suspect. An analysis of Nelson's financial accounts showed no suspicious movements of funds, which ruled out the version of kidnapping for ransom, leaving only the darkest and most personal motives on the table. Detectives reconstructed his last week before the hike, step by step, trying to find any signs of stress or atypical behavior. But James Nelson remained an enigma, even to those who thought they knew him well. The mountains continued to be silent, and the inexorably passing time turned this investigation into a real battle of wits between the police and a man who made the wilderness his home. Dear friends, before we continue to investigate this gruesome case, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and like this video. This is extremely important for the development of the project because YouTube's algorithms are guided by your activity and help promote the video so that more people can watch it and learn the truth about these events. Thank you for being with us. And now, let's get back to the Appalachian forests. July 7, 2017 was the day when the foundation of the case against 30-year-old James Nelson gave the first serious crack, changing the direction of the entire investigation. While one group of detectives continued to examine every document in the guide's past, the results of a detailed analysis of the girl's clothes found near the cliff of Charlize Banyan came back from a crime lab in Nashville. Experts found microscopic traces of epithelium and fatty secretions on the turquoise sports top that contained a DNA profile that did not belong to either 24-year-old Zoe Morris or James Nelson. This discovery was a real turning point that instantly brought the investigation to a standstill, as the initial theory of a kidnapping guide, which seemed so logical and simple, began to fall apart before the detectives' eyes. Investigators were faced with a difficult choice. Was it a real trace of a third party who interfered with the hike at an altitude of more than 5,000 feet? Or perhaps James Nelson, using his professional knowledge, deliberately left biological traces on his clothes to lead the police astray and buy time to hide? The sheriff of Sevier County decided to check both versions simultaneously, not ruling out any scenario. Detectives began to scrutinize the last 6 months of James Nelson's life even more closely, focusing on his social contacts in the town of Gatlinburg. Investigators interviewed dozens of people, from employees of tourist equipment stores to regular visitors to local cafes, where the guide usually had breakfast before going on a tour. Most of his colleagues continued to characterize him as an exceptional professional who never violated safety rules. But during in-depth conversations, strange details began to emerge that no one had previously paid attention to. According to Thomas Reed, the owner of one of the shops where James often updated his gear, the 30-year-old guide had been looking extremely depressed and anxious lately. Thomas recalled that during their last meeting, 8 days before he disappeared, James kept looking back at the front door as if expecting someone unwanted to come in. When Thomas asked if everything was okay, Nelson only briefly dropped a line about the mountains becoming too crowded for everyone and hinted at some serious problems that he did not want to talk about in detail, saying that it's not the kind of conversation you have in a public place. Other witnesses, including Sarah Jenkins, a waitress at a local bar, confirmed these observations, noting that in the weeks before the hike with Zoe, James had become much more silent and often sat at a table in the corner studying some maps that were not part of the official national park routes. These testimonies made the police seriously question whether James Nelson was a cold-blooded aggressor preparing the ground for the crime, or whether he himself was the victim of some circumstances or an unknown person along with Zoe Morris. Investigators began to analyze in detail the CCTV footage around the guide's apartment, trying to identify any car or person who might have followed him. Time was ticking inexorably, and each new day of fruitless searching increased tension among the public and pressure on the sheriff's office. The countdown was no longer in hours, but in minutes, as the chances of finding the girl alive after 21 days in the wild without proper clothing were rapidly approaching zero. The investigation team received permission to expand the geography of the checks, covering not only Nelson's professional environment, but also his possible personal conflicts, about which he preferred to remain silent. The search teams in the forest received new instructions to look for any signs of a third person's presence, including leftover shell casings, specific footwear, or footprints that did not match James Nelson's protocols. An atmosphere of tense anticipation prevailed at the investigation headquarters as each new detail was analyzed under a microscope. Profiling psychologists pointed out that if Nelson really felt threatened, his decision to take his client hiking could have been either an act of desperation or an attempt to maintain the normalcy of his life despite the pressure. However, the DNA of the unknown man on Zoe's clothing remained a major mystery, as it did not match any profile in the database, which included thousands of convicted felons in the state. This meant that the person who left these marks could either be a complete dark horse for the system or someone who had never attracted the attention of law enforcement before. The Tennessee State Police began preparing requests to neighboring counties, trying to find similar cases of disappearances or assaults in the Appalachian Mountains over the past 5 years. Every mile of forest was now seen as a potential place where a mystery could be hiding, turning a professional hike into a tragedy with many unknowns. Zoe Morris's relatives, having learned about the new circumstances, began to demand more transparency from the police as the version of the guide's guilt no longer seemed so untenable. The lights of the desk lamps in the detectives' offices stayed on until the early morning hours as they built complex schemes of connections, trying to find a point of contact between James, Zoe, and the unknown man whose DNA remained on the torn turquoise cloth. Every fact, every word of the witness was carefully compared with the timeline of events on June 12, 2017. The realization that there could be someone else in the forest, invisible, trained, and extremely dangerous, created a feeling of cold anxiety even among experienced police officers. Case number 7283 was turning into a large-scale hunt for a ghost whose name still remained hidden behind the tall pines and rocky gorges of the Great Smoky Mountains. On July 11, 2017, the investigation into the disappearance of Zoe Morris and James Nelson entered a phase of in-depth analysis of the professional environment of mountain guides in the town of Gatlinburg. Investigators from the Sevier County Sheriff's Office decided to look into the activities of 30-year-old James Nelson in more detail, assuming that his professional life could be the source of the depression and anxiety that his friends had previously mentioned. The detectives conducted dozens of grueling interviews, talking to everyone who worked on the challenging Appalachian trails every day, and knew James not only as a colleague, but also as a competitor. Most of the experienced guides, including 40-year Mountain Service veteran David Miller, described Nelson as an exceptional professional and a man of extremely high moral character who never compromised the safety of his clients. Colleagues categorically refused to believe that such a man could kidnap or harm a 24-year-old girl, as his reputation over the past 10 years had been impeccable. However, during one of the long conversations in a local bar for Forest Service workers, one of the guides mentioned that the working atmosphere in the town had been extremely tense recently. The reason for this was an open conflict between James and an ambitious newcomer to their field, 33-year-old Samuel Brooks. It turned out that the two men not only did not get along, but had a serious and long-running feud over the distribution of the most popular and profitable trails that ran through scenic areas at an altitude of over 6,000 feet. One of their clashes was even public, becoming a major topic of gossip among local tourism industry workers and volunteers. Witnesses to the incident, including an outfitter's shop owner, recalled that Samuel Brooks often lost his temper and publicly hurled aggressive language at James. According to the reconstruction of the events according to eyewitnesses, Brooks once exclaimed that he would certainly deal with Nelson at the first opportunity when the mountains left them alone. After receiving this important information, the police realized that professional envy, or a deep personal grudge from an aggressive competitor, could have been the hidden factor that made James constantly look back in the months before his disappearance. Detectives began to consider the possibility that Samuel Brooks might have been following the Nelson and Morris group from the very beginning of their ascent on June 12, 2017. Now the investigation wanted to find out whether this conflict was just an exchange of angry words in public, or whether it could have escalated into something much more serious and bloody on the remote trails of the Great Smoky Mountains, where there are no security cameras or bystanders. The police began to study the 33-year-old Brooks' background in detail, discovering that he had experience working in extreme conditions on the West Coast and had rock climbing skills. This made him no less dangerous a rival than Nelson himself. Profiling psychologists noticed that Samuel had a short temper and reacted sharply to any professional failures, blaming them on more successful colleagues. Detectives began analyzing the movements of Brooks' car on the day of Zoe's disappearance, trying to find a point of contact between it and the group's route from Newfound Gap. An atmosphere of suspicion reigned in the town of Gatlinburg as each new fact about the guides' feud added fuel to the fire of general anxiety. Investigators realized that if the version of the competition was correct, then James Nelson might not have been the aggressor, but the primary target, and Zoe Morris just happened to be around at the most inopportune moment. The clock was ticking, as any delay could lead to the destruction of evidence that could link Brooks to the location of the girl's clothes. The Tennessee State Police began preparing documents to obtain search warrants for Samuel's property, hoping to find at least one clue leading to the truth. Every mile of woods around Charlie's Banyan Rock was now viewed through the prism of this professional confrontation. The case number 7283 was becoming increasingly gloomy, and the forest, which had previously been considered a place of peace, now seemed to be an arena for a brutal massacre motivated by simple human hatred and thirst for recognition. The detectives restored the chain of events step by step, hoping that one of the locals or other guides had seen Samuel Brooks in the mountains at the fateful time when Zoe's phone disappeared from the network forever. The tension in the sheriff's office reached its peak when it became clear that they were dealing with a man who knew the mountains as well as the official searchers and was able to professionally hide his tracks among the rocks and dense thickets of the Appalachians. The harsh nature of the Great Smoky Mountains continued to maintain its silence, but now the investigation knew exactly where to look for cracks in the perfectly constructed alibi of a competitor who considered himself the owner of these trails. On July 14, 2017, a group of detectives arrived at a private house on the outskirts of the town of Townsend, where 33-year-old Samuel Brooks lived. According to the police report, Brooks greeted the officers on the porch with visible irritation, but agreed to a brief conversation in his living room, which also served as a mountain equipment repair shop. During the conversation, the man did not try to hide his deep dislike of 30-year-old James Nelson. On the contrary, he openly and emotionally stated that he was a fraud who did not deserve his popularity among tourists. Brooks claimed that James was allegedly using cheap marketing instead of real survival skills, and assured investigators that Nelson had been acting extremely suspicious lately. According to Samuel, he had seen his colleague on the trail several times in the weeks before his disappearance, and he looked like a scared and tense person, afraid of his own shadow. While one of the detectives was taking notes, another officer, Deputy Michael Lawson, was looking around the room and noticed an open plastic container with a white powdery substance on Samuel's desk: rock climbing magnesia. It was the same substance that microscopic particles of which had previously been found by experts on Zoe Morris's torn turquoise clothing during a laboratory analysis in Nashville. When the tone of the conversation changed abruptly and Brooks was asked directly where he was and what he had been doing throughout the day, on June 12, 2017, his previous confidence and arrogance instantly disappeared. According to the interrogation report, the man became visibly nervous and confused in his own testimony. At first, he confidently stated that he had spent the entire day at home cleaning the basement, but within a few minutes, he changed his story, claiming that he was in a completely different area of the national park, 20 miles from Newfound Gap, where he was allegedly checking the condition of the rocky areas. His manner of communication became openly aggressive, raising his voice and nervously tugging at the hem of his shirt, avoiding direct eye contact with the officers. The detectives noted that Brooks was unable to provide any alibi that could be corroborated by other people's testimony or by CCTV footage from gas stations or stores. It became quite clear to the officers that this man was hiding something much more terrible and bloody than simple professional envy or dislike of a successful colleague. Deputy Lawson later noted in his report that the air in the room seemed to become heavier at that moment, and Brooks's reaction to a simple question about his whereabouts was a classic sign of hidden guilt. Investigators decided not to make an immediate arrest to prevent the suspect from destroying possible physical evidence, but they did set up round-the-clock surveillance of his Townsend home. Samuel's every move, every time he left the house, was now recorded by special technical means. Profiler psychologists who analyzed the video of this conversation noticed how he abruptly switched from attacking Nelson's reputation to a defensive position as soon as the subject of a specific date came up. His fatal mistake was not only confusing his location, but also leaving a substance in plain sight that directly linked him to the girl's belongings, which were found 8 miles from the official route. As Brooks continued to pace nervously around the living room under close police surveillance, detectives at headquarters began preparing an expanded warrant request for a full search of not only the house, but all vehicles belonging to Samuel. They realized that this man, with his vast experience in rock climbing and multi-day hiking, could easily get anywhere in the Great Smoky Mountains without being noticed by ordinary rangers. Case number 7283 had a new, very real figure, whose shadow was now clearly visible behind every mysterious detail of the disappearance of 24-year-old Zoe Morris. The atmosphere around the Townsend home was becoming increasingly tense, and the detectives felt that they were one step away from uncovering what had really happened at 5,000 feet on the foggy morning of June 12th. Every detail in Samuel's behavior, from his aggressive gestures to his trembling hands, would become part of the indictment that was being prepared in the prosecutor's office. Brooks's neighbors later recalled that he always seemed to them to be a man of difficult character, but no one could imagine that something so horrible was behind it. While the police waited for legal confirmation of their actions, the Great Smoky Mountains forest continued to hold its guard, hiding the bodies of those who never returned from the Newfound Gap Walk. The next steps of the investigation were to be decisive in this game of cat and mouse, where the truth was at stake and the highest price was paid. On July 15, 2017, the investigation team received an official warrant for a detailed analysis of the movements of 33-year-old Samuel Brooks's cell phone, and the billing data obtained shocked even experienced detectives. According to the cellular operator's reports, on the morning of June 12, 2017, Brooks's device was detected in the Newfound Gap area, just as 24-year-old Zoe Morris and 30-year-old James Nelson were leaving for their route. After that, at 9:20 in the morning, Samuel's phone was completely turned off for 5 hours and reappeared online in a completely different part of the national park, 12 miles from the starting point. At the same time, the results of an in-depth laboratory examination confirmed that the magnesia microparticles and fibers of a rare synthetic rope seized during the search of Brooks's home were identical in chemical composition and structure to the materials found on the girl's turquoise clothes. However, the decisive evidence was waiting for detectives in Samuel's basement. During a second, more thorough inspection of the room, behind a hidden wooden panel under a tool rack, the detectives found a small niche where a Garmin wristwatch belonging to James Nelson was lying. Dried traces of blood were clearly visible on the case of the device and on the broken strap. Samuel Brooks was immediately arrested and taken to the sheriff's office for formal questioning. After 9 hours of tense communication under the pressure of irrefutable technical and biological evidence, the man finally broke down. According to the confession protocol, Samuel Brooks confirmed that his professional dislike of James Nelson had developed into a real obsession. He admitted that over the past month he had repeatedly followed his competitor, studying his schedules and habits. On June 12th, he deliberately left early, left his SUV in an inconspicuous place, and began a parallel tracking of the group, moving through dense brush off the official trails. His initial plan was to wait for the moment when they stopped for a rest stop at the most remote point to intimidate James, use physical force, and force him to retire from the tourism business in the area forever. At one of the remote rocky sections 5 miles from Newfound Gap, where the trail becomes extremely narrow and dangerous, a sudden fight broke out between the men. Brooks claimed that James tried to defend himself using a hiking stick, but in a fit of rage, Samuel picked up a massive sharp rock weighing about 4 pounds and struck Nelson fatally on the head. Zoe Morris, who happened to witness this brutal massacre, began to scream and in a state of panic tried to run down the hill through the dense undergrowth of laurel. However, the killer, having the skills of a professional cross-country runner, quickly caught up with the girl. He treated her with particular cruelty in order to eliminate the only person who could testify against him in court. After committing the double murder, Samuel Brooks devised a cynical plan to stage a disappearance. He waited until dusk, using his knowledge of the terrain at an altitude of over 4,000 feet, and moved the bodies deep into the woods, where he had prepared a place to hide them in advance. A few days later, he deliberately returned to the park to plant Zoe's torn clothes near the Charles Banyan Cliff, 8 miles from the actual scene. Brooks hoped that detectives, having found the girl's belongings so far from the route with no trace of her guide, would conclude that it was James Nelson who committed the crime and escaped with her, using his professional skills. His calculation was based on the fact that without Nelson's body, all the blame would automatically fall on the guide, and Samuel himself would remain above suspicion as an offended competitor with an alibi. During the reconstruction of the crime, Brooks described in detail how he tried to destroy all traces of the struggle on the trail by covering the blood with dry earth and pine needles. The officers who conducted the interrogation noted the cold and methodical tone with which the man spoke about the last minutes of the 24-year-old girl's life. His every word was confirmed by the evidence found earlier, from microparticles of magnesia that got on Zoya's clothes from his hands during the struggle to specific damage to the fabric from sharp stones. Case number 7283, which for 3 weeks had been considered a mysterious disappearance in the Appalachian fog, finally turned into a story of a double murder motivated only by professional envy and uncontrollable aggression. Investigators recorded the coordinates of the place where the killer said the victim's remains were hidden, and the next morning they prepared for the most difficult part of their job. In his report to the prosecutor's office, the Sevier County Sheriff noted that Brooks' actions were calculated with the precision of a professional hunter who used the mountains not as a source of inspiration, but as a tool to hide his identity. Zoe's parents, who were informed about the confession late in the evening, were in a state of shock because the person who was supposed to be their main suspect turned out to be just a tool in the hands of a much more terrible monster. The blood on James Nelson's watch was a mute witness to the fact that he had tried to fulfill his professional duty to the last, protecting his client at the cost of his own life. The maps laid out in the headquarters were now marked with the final dots that would forever change the history of these mountainsides. Every mile of forest that had previously been considered a place of mystery was now revealing its real, bloody truth. The harsh nature of the Great Smoky Mountains no longer remained silent, giving away the names of those who fell victim to human malice under the cover of centuries-old trees. The case was moving towards its logical and tragic conclusion, leaving behind only pain and the realization of how easily professional competition can turn into a deadly trap for innocent people. The detectives, completing the interrogation report at 4 o'clock in the morning, realized that there was still a long process of identification and collection of additional evidence ahead. But the main thing was done. The killer himself told the story of his downfall, which began with one fatal mistake in his carefully laid out plan. The trial of 33-year-old Samuel Brooks began on March 12, 2018, in the Knoxville District Court, and instantly became one of the most notorious and gloomy cases in the modern history of Tennessee. The courtroom was packed to the brim with journalists, volunteers who had participated in the grueling 3-week search, and concerned citizens of Gatlinburg who wanted to see the face of the man who had turned a national park into a place of bloody massacre. In his speech, the prosecutor reconstructed in detail every step of the killer's journey, relying on cell phone billing data and forensic evidence that became the irrefutable foundation of the prosecution. The main physical evidence in the case was Zoe Morris's torn turquoise sports top with traces of Brooks's magnesia and James Nelson's watch found in his basement, which contained the DNA of both victims under a microscope. During the announcement of the verdict, the room was dead silent, broken only by the heavy breathing of the defendant, who tried to maintain a mask of indifference until the last moment. The jury deliberated for more than 8 hours and finally reached an unequivocal decision. Samuel Brooks was found guilty of aggravated first-degree double murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of any early release, noting in his conclusion that the cruelty and calculation shown by the perpetrator went beyond human understanding. This story has left a deep and painful scar on the entire community of hikers and professional guides on the Appalachian Trail. For years, the route from Newfound Gap, where the tragedy occurred, was grimly known among locals as the Cursed Path, and many hikers began to avoid remote areas near Charles Banyan Rock, feeling the invisible presence of past horror there. The parents of 24-year-old Zoe, Patricia, and Robert Morris have never fully recovered from the loss of their only daughter, whose life was cut short at the very peak of her dreams. They have devoted all their efforts and savings to creating a specialized safety fund called Zoe's Light, which provides tourists with personal satellite beacons free of charge and develops emergency communication systems for hard-to-reach mountainous areas. In his interview for the documentary project a year after the trial, Robert Morris said that they cannot turn back the clock, but they can try to save others from a similar fate by making the mountains less dangerous for those seeking peace there. 30-year-old James Nelson was officially and posthumously exonerated in the eyes of the public. The state police made a public apology to the family of the deceased for their initial suspicions, and colleagues installed a small memorial plaque at the beginning of his favorite trail. The price of this truth was too high: 2 ruined lives, broken families, and a forever lost sense of safety in the wilderness. Case number 7283 was officially closed on October 14, 2018, remaining in the archives as a reminder to every hiker that the real danger in the mountains does not come from wild animals, unpredictable avalanches, or steep cliffs thousands of feet high. It sometimes hides in human envy, anger, and an uncontrollable desire for control that can lurk behind the next tree or behind the back of someone you thought was a professional colleague. The shadows of the Great Smoky Mountains continue to hold the memory of those who never returned to the silver spruce, and the sound of the wind in the pines reminds us of the last message sent at 9 o'clock in the morning on June 12th. Zoe Morris's story has become an eternal warning that sometimes the heart of beautiful landscapes reveals an abyss that no map can measure, and that the truth found 21 days later in the dense undergrowth changed the face of Appalachia forever. Today, the Morris Foundation continues its work, having trained hundreds of people in survival skills and provided over $200,000 worth of equipment. But for Patricia and Robert, the mountains will always remain the place where their sunshine was extinguished forever under the weight of other people's hatred. The detectives' offices are now busy with new cases, but the file number 7283 often appears in lectures for future forensic scientists as an example of how important every microscopic detail is, even if it is just white magnesia dust on the fabric of a sports shirt. The mountains continue to be silent, hiding under their majesty the scars of events that will never be forgotten.